politics is really about this battle over images. What are we allowed to show and what's allowed to be remembered? And so a lot of my practice sort of revolves around that concept and is compelled by questions usually that are provoked through an object or a document or historical fact or material that feels contested. So in the works that I have here at IMMA, I have two pieces that are part of a larger project that revolves around Iris Chang, who was the author of the book called The Rape of Nanking, which was published in 1998. And it was the book that really broke the story to the West around the atrocities that were committed by the Japanese in China during World War II. That compelled me about the Nanjing Massacre was Iris Chang's relationship to the massacre vis-a-vis her grandparents who were survivors. I think that her relationship really clearly explicates what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory, which is the concept that through intergenerational storytelling, that the memories of violent and traumatic histories get passed on and in some ways taken up by the daughters and granddaughters of people who survive violent histories. To use a Fanonian phrase, a Franz Fanon phrase called epidermalize, which is to sort of take in these memories as part of her own being. I mean, Fanon talks about epidermalization in terms of language, but I sort of transpose it to think about also, I think it also makes sense to talk about it in terms of memory. I was really fascinated in this, and especially in the light that she committed suicide, and not to pathologize or to make this sort of obvious, not to sort of say if you take on post-memory or you take on the memories of other people that it then sort of results in that. But to me, it seemed to really clearly signify this concept in a really powerful way. I was just remembering a quote that I read of hers in her archives. She's using language to talk about a kind of separation between herself and maybe her memories. And I think that in terms of dealing with trauma, there is this way of having to externalize through sort of testimony and through speaking that difficult and violent histories have to sort of go through this process of being externalized in order for us to sort of be able to live with them. And so for her, there was this inability to kind of separate herself from them. A Measure of Remorse takes archival interview that was conducted by journalist Elizabeth Farnsworth between her and the ambassador to the U.S. from Japan at the time, Ambassador Saito, in conjunction with filmed scenes with actors who kind of portray the three characters in kind of a dreamlike scene where the three figures are embracing and in a kind of physically intimate, sort of tender relationship with each other, in contrast to the audio, which is a soundtrack that goes from being unintelligible conversation between them to moments of clarity where they're arguing about what constitutes an apology. I think of language as being kind of a material also in my work, and A Measure of Remorse, I'm using language in a way to sort of point out how language fails when we're trying to express violent history or trauma. Lacan writes about, when we are young babies and sort of entering into language is sort of the first moment at which we are sort of severed irreparably from ourselves, in the sense that every time we speak, we're constantly being othered by ourselves and through a relationship with another person. And so I think that that's really a profound concept for my work, in the sense that it's that I think about that when, especially in relationship to how we think about communicating and expressing something like remorse or apology for traumatic events or violent history. Iris Chang and Ambassador Saito kind of go back and forth arguing over what constitutes an apology, where, the way that I sort of edit the piece together raises questions around speaking for oneself and speaking for the nation, or speaking for a group of people, and how, in some ways language and types of language really constricts us to speaking in a certain way, but also just in terms of formally, like that the ambassador is speaking for the nation and sort of is speaking in a very kind of political language that doesn't allow him to enact an apology on a personal level, where Iris Chang is trying to get him to enact an apology on a really intimate level, and those two things don't ever meet up, and don't ever sort of resolve themselves. So there's that kind of aspect of language on a kind of like structural level, but also I think on a more psychoanalytic level, this idea that language, even if he did apologize it in some way, that there's this sense that it would never be enough for Iris Chang. And so this idea that, that as much as we might be able to try to externalize and work through a kind of traumatic history, through a kind of transposing or externalization of memory, that language still is impossibly inadequate. The piece kind of revolves around two pieces of interview, two testimonies that are made by a Nanjing survivor named Shasta Quinn, who's in her 80s and has been telling her story about the massacre for about almost 30 years now. I use an interview that Iris Chang did in 1995, and then also the interview that I did with her in 2013. And the two stories echo each other in the piece and move between her telling the story to me and then her telling the story to Iris Chang. I wanted to double the testimony and kind of echo it to sort of call attention to the repetition of the storytelling, how through that repetition the story becomes sedimented in a way that is about pointing to narratives and their role in kind of official sort of history making, in the sense that she's been telling the story over and over again, that parts of the story become almost like just pieces of the story that she's sort of moving around. Even though the story is quite intense and very difficult to listen to, and really she gets emotional during parts of the interview, it sort of goes between that sort of very personal, intimate part with understanding the story as this sort of very sedimented narrative that she's had to tell over and over again. So I wanted to call attention to that sort of tension, and not to discount the personal story, but also to understand that once the narrative gets externalized, how it then becomes a part of a kind of structure of history through that storytelling. The imagery in the piece is a piece of sort of continuous tracking, very slow sort of pan over the mass grave that is sort of the center kind of exhibition in the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Museum in Nanjing, China. And so it's just dirt and bones. And it's a very close, tight tracking shot that kind of goes in and out of focus. So at moments is abstract and at moments is clear, but constantly moving. And so you hear her voice in these two moments in time, a very clear recording that I made, and then this sort of more degraded recording of her from Iris Chang's recording in 95. So you hear her voice in also tension with this imagery that you see. And so I was interested in thinking about, one, wanting to really withhold her body as sort of evidence, this sort of living testimony, and think about just sort of highlighting or sort of framing her testimony in terms of her voice and language in relationship to sort of the remains and the sort of evidence that gets mobilized or sort of instrumentalized in historical narratives, and for the purpose of kind of, sort of national kind of, in this sense, a kind of national mourning of this event. So sort of holding these two things in tension. What is it that we require or demand or expect from narratives in order to sort of fully understand a story? Is it the evidence that makes it feel real? Is it the body? Is it the material remains that make the truth undeniable? Or is it the stories? And what is the relationship between those two things? One of the main concepts that drives my work around memory is the concept of belatedness, which is a term that comes from theorist Kathy Carruth. But this idea that actually there's always this delay that happens when we're dealing with trauma and violence, that in fact, and I think, and Marianne Hirsch and her concept of post-memory is also built into this idea that things always happen secondarily, that actually it takes a moment that actually in the moment there's never this way of sort of fully kind of incorporating it into sort of our consciousness, or that it plays out in ways that always show that it's always sort of a belated kind of understanding or a belated kind of manifestation in our lives. And thinking about dislocation and sort of sites ruptured by violent war. Unfortunately, they're just not going away, and they're even more present today than I think they have been in a while. And so I think that it's really important to sort of, kind of frame history in this kind of way to understand that actually there's not this sort of sense of a kind of very simple linear teleology. In fact, things are constantly in some ways on a loop, and which I think for me is a lot of why we don't learn from the past, and there's a sense that things are always repeating themselves, or history repeats itself because of the ways that this is how kind of trauma works on us. For me, my work is really about not framing stories as the past, but really thinking about their relationship to the present and how we sort of live through or become through these stories. This idea of sort of, kind of becoming through history or becoming through memory. My parents fled Vietnam in 1975, and my mom was actually pregnant with me when she fled. Being, in my mom's womb, in this journey, this very intense and physically traumatic journey for my parents, and being in the womb at that time, and how that feels to me like a kind of metaphor for my work, this sort of liminal space between here and there, between two cultures, between two nations, between memories, between languages. And so I grew up with my parents telling me stories of the war, not voluntarily. There were very specific little stories that they would tell me, like repeated stories that they would tell me over and over again. I think this also what makes me think about repetition as this sort of structuring device for trauma. It's this desire to have to sort of, this compulsion to repeat, which is sort of an idea that Freud talks about in The Death Drive, where, trauma gets repeated as a way to sort of, in some ways, externalize. And there is, for him, he talks about it as a drive towards death, which is really like a pre-linguistic state in terms of Lacan's sort of formulation, but this idea that we have to repeat in order to get back to this other state that feels more close to who we are.